For everyone curious as to why this lady would move to Afghanistan for her husband, what are you thinking? Why would you subjugate yourself to that? I know exactly why. I know there are 4 possible reasons as to why she's moving to Afghanistan. Before I start, I want to say I'm very experienced in this area. For years, I have worked with Afghan advocacy groups, refugee resettlement, working with refugees when they get to the United States. I've even worked and done research for research institutes in Kabul who publish research about Afghan culture and preserving Afghan minorities. I have worked and seen basically everything. So when I tell you that these are 4 very possible reasons, I am not making this up. This is not a conspiracy theory. Reason number 1 is she actually thinks that she's better than Afghan women. Like, she thinks that she's not going to be treated like that because she's American. She's going to have some special status or special privileges that the other Afghan women won't have. And honestly, this mindset is quite literally disgusting, but it's the truth. She probably thinks that I'm American, and based on how the Taliban has treated white female tourists in the past, which they've been allowed to walk around more freely than Afghan women, this is what she probably thinks. 2, her husband could be a Taliban official, so when she moves to Afghanistan with her Taliban government official boyfriend or husband, she'll be afforded special rights that the rest of the Afghan women won't be because her hubby's in power. I mean, even with the Taliban officials, we see this, that their daughters and their wives are often afforded rights and special privileges that the rest of Afghan women are not allowed. 3, this could be a PR initiative by the Taliban. The Taliban has done this before, so this is not some crazy conspiracy theory. They've had white men come in and be tourists, and they've had like Talib bros take them around, speak perfect English, make jokes, and it's part of this like PR campaign. And then they'll have people comment like, wow, I didn't know the Taliban was this chill. They've done this before. So this very well could be that they're funding her to go to Afghanistan to show the rest of the world, like, guys, we don't even treat our women that bad. Like, see this American lady, she wants to come to Afghanistan. Like, we're cool. And in that case, she wouldn't be subjugated to the oppression that the rest of the women in Afghanistan are subjugated to, because the Taliban is literally paying her for this propaganda. Mind you, if you think that the Taliban hasn't seen the videos of this American lady, you're very gravely mistaken. Speaking from experience, I know how hard it is to communicate with people within Afghanistan without proper end-to-end encrypted channels, because the Taliban keeps very heavy surveillance. They keep very heavy surveillance on people talking. They keep very heavy surveillance on what's posted about them. This is their number 1 thing. They have most definitely seen videos of her. That leads into my 4th point, is that she actually is a dumbass and she actually wants to move to Afghanistan, but after the Taliban saw her videos, they're not going to treat her as poorly because the whole internet knows that she's going there. So it's going to become a public debacle, whereas like the rest of the women in Afghanistan are nameless and faceless. So it's okay to subjugate them to oppression. But while the rest of the world is watching this American woman move to Afghanistan, they can't do the same thing. In a way, posting these videos and you guys engaging with her videos gives her some sense of security, because she thinks that the world is watching her, so no one is going to attack her or give her any oppression, and she'll be safe from that. Honestly, this is disgusting and despicable. This behavior is absolutely horrendous, and she genuinely thinks that she is superior to the average Afghan population, which shows us that American imperialism lives on. I also want to end off by saying that these are just my expert opinions on what the possibilities could be. None of these are confirmed facts, so please do not take my word as confirmed fact unless we hear specifically from her. These are just my expert opinions on what the possibilities could be. The United States is the reason that Afghan women are so oppressed today. The United States is also the reason that the current government in Afghanistan is a terrorist organization. If you want to educate yourself more on the situation in Afghanistan today, I'm going to give you a brief historical context of the events leading up to the current situation. Now, Afghanistan has an incredibly rich history, so many different events, but just for the sake of this video being focused on the US role in Afghanistan, I'm going to start the history off at the Soviet invasion. Now, the Soviet rule in Afghanistan was between 1979 to 1989. This is when the USSR took power, and this was also the time of the Cold War. So the United States' number 1 enemy was Russia. The number 1 enemy was the spread of communism through the USSR. The United States wants to destroy the USSR. So how do they do this? The CIA runs one of the largest covert operations in CIA history called Operation Cyclone. So the United States starts to fund Afghan fighters called the Mujahideen. They start off funding them $20 to $30 million a year in the beginning of the 80s, and by 1987, they were funding them $630 million a year. And these Afghan fighters would obviously use the arms that they got from the US to then fight against the current USSR government. The Mujahideen actually at this time in America were hailed as heroes for fighting against communism. And actually Saudi Arabia did the same thing. They roughly matched US funding dollar for dollar in funding these Afghan fighters to fight against the Soviet communism. Pakistan was the middleman for all of this. They were responsible for taking the US funding and Saudi funding and distributing it to Mujahideen groups. So they chose Islamic extremist groups. They would take them and then train them in Gulf-funded camps in Pakistan. In 1989, the Soviet Union collapses after failing to defeat so many insurgencies. The United States wins. We win the Cold War. So what do? We leave Afghanistan. That was our battleground, and now we don't have to clean up. So that leaves the Mujahideen, the armed Afghan forces, with a shit ton of arms and a shit ton of money. So what do? They don't have a common enemy to fight against, so they start fighting against each other. They form different tribes, the Pashtuns, Tajiks, Uzbeks, different tribes start forming different factions, and they start fighting against each other. Afghanistan has now erupted in a full-blown civil war, and this civil war did more damage to the infrastructure in Afghanistan than the Soviet occupation did. This is where the Taliban forms. The Taliban was one of these groups. It was the Pashtun majority group that was funded by Pakistan and ISI. They take over and they eventually win the civil war in 1996 and take full control over the country. Now, just to clarify, the Taliban came out of the US-funded Mujahideen. The United States did in fact create the current Taliban problem that we have today. So from 1996 to 2001, you have the first Taliban regime, which was also incredibly oppressive towards women. You had mandatory burqas. Women were not allowed to go to school. Music was banned. Even Afghan minorities, like religious minorities, were also persecuted against. They had to wear yellow bands on their arms to symbolize that they were not Muslims to the government, similarly to Jews in Nazi Germany. And also they had to pay jizya, which is a non-Muslim tax. It was just an incredibly oppressive environment. Then 9/11 happened and the United States took control of Afghanistan fully. A lot of people believe that the United States finally brought democracy to Afghanistan, but this is the furthest thing from the truth. Not only did Afghanistan already have its own system of democracy called the Loya Jirga that actually is older than the United States version of democracy, but the United States faked a lot of elections in Afghanistan. In 2009, this president that the United States has picked for Afghanistan was up for re-election. They manufactured fake voting spots, ghost polling spots, that when you would go, they would be written on paper that there's a polling spot there. You would go and they realize, oh my God, there's no place to vote here. They manufactured tens and thousands of fake ballots, and they did this all through Hamid Karzai's brother, who was on the CIA's payroll. They did this in the 2014 election when it was Ashraf Ghani versus Abdullah Abdullah. They manufactured fake voting locations, there were fake ballots, and when they finally couldn't come to a conclusion, instead of letting the Afghan people do a runoff election, the Secretary of State at the time, John Kerry, came and he decided who was going to be the president. And actually the UN purports that actually Abdullah Abdullah would have won the election, but John Kerry chose Ashraf Ghani to be the president of Afghanistan at the time. Also, the United States has claimed to be against the opium drug trade in Afghanistan, which actually turned out not to be true because CIA was caught funding Hamid Karzai's brother, and he was involved in the opium drug trade. So they were funding the same crisis that they were also claiming to be against. Another thing, the US would create this fake illusion of economy, a shadow economy, and they would fund private contractors and they would fund the militias of different warlords instead of directly funding the Afghan army. So what this did is this created more tribalism because now there's different warlords who are getting US cash and US arms without the oversight of the Afghan government, which was the reason that it was able to so easily collapse when the United States left. That's why the Taliban was able to take such power, because the United States was still funding separate militias, separate war groups. They were never interested in strengthening the Afghan government so that it could stand up for itself. So the US is the reason. The US is the reason they funded the Mujahideen, which became the Taliban, which is the same Taliban that is oppressing women today and forcing them to wear burqas. So yes, this is a feminist issue, but more importantly, this is an imperialist issue.